The dark lessons that turn ordinary minds into weapons. Machiavelli imagine a world where your kindness is mistaken for weakness, your honesty makes you vulnerable, and your trust is the very thing that breaks you. Now ask yourself, what if everything you were taught about being good, ethical, and fair was designed to make you easy to control? That's where we begin. This isn't just a story about Machiavelli, the Renaissance thinker whose name has become synonymous with manipulation and deceit. This is a confrontation with yourself, with power, and with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the darker lessons are the ones that free you. Machiavelli didn't write for cowards. He wrote for those willing to see the world not as we wish it to be, but as it is. In his most famous work, The Prince, he lays bare a reality that most people spend their lives denying, that morality, in the hands of the powerful, but is often nothing more than a strategy. Not a principle, not a virtue, a tool. And if you don't understand how that tool is used, you will be used by it. Let's be honest, most of us want to believe that good things happen to good people. That if we're sincere, hardworking, and kind, life will reward us. But Machiavelli pulls the mask off that fantasy. He shows us that power doesn't reward virtue, it rewards strategy. But it rewards clarity. It rewards those who see human nature not in its ideal form, but in its raw, unfiltered truth. And this is where we start to feel uncomfortable. Because deep down, we know he's not wrong. How many times have you seen someone rise not because they were the most ethical, but because they were the most calculating? How many times has honesty cost you an opportunity? How often has silence been safer than truth? These aren't just rhetorical questions, they're reminders that the game being played around us has rules no one teaches us, unless we learn them ourselves.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Machiavelli's dark genius lies in this: he teaches you how to win in a world that doesn't play fair. He doesn't tell you to be evil, he tells you to be aware, to understand that people are not always what they seem. That promises are often lies wrapped in charm, that loyalty is conditional, and that love, in the political realm, is far less reliable than fear. He writes, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." But that's not a call to cruelty, it's a call to realism, a warning, a test. Can you stomach the truth, or do you still need the comfort of illusion? Let's push deeper. Machiavelli forces us to confront a brutal paradox. To maintain peace, sometimes you must use force. To protect the innocent, you may have to outwit the wicked. To build something lasting, you may need to get your hands dirty. And if you refuse, if you cling to the fantasy that good intentions are enough, then someone more ruthless will make the decisions you're too afraid to face. But here's where the twist comes in. The most powerful lesson Machiavelli offers isn't about domination, it's about self-awareness. He's not just giving advice to rulers, he's handing a mirror to anyone willing to look into it. And what you see might disturb you. Because you'll realize that power is not about controlling others, it's about controlling yourself. Your impulses, your emotions, your assumptions. Ordinary minds react. Weaponized minds respond. With precision, with patience, with purpose. Let me ask you something that most people are afraid to think about. Would you rather be morally pure and powerless, or morally flexible and influential? And before you answer, consider this: if the world is being shaped by those willing to bend the rules, are you comfortable letting them write the future while you sit on the sidelines? Or are you ready to enter the arena not as a villain, but as someone who understands that sometimes the path to good must pass through shadows? That's the central Machiavellian dilemma, and it's easy to misunderstand. People think Machiavelli was advocating for cruelty, but he wasn't. He was advocating for clarity. He understood that if you want to protect what matters, your family, your vision, your values, you need to know how power works. Because if you don't, someone else will use it against you. And they won't hesitate. We're not talking about becoming cold or ruthless. We're talking about becoming sharp, about turning your mind into a weapon, not to destroy others, but to defend yourself from being destroyed, about learning the strategies of manipulation, not so you can manipulate, but so you can see it coming. So you can say no to the wrong people, walk away from false promises, and never again be a pawn in someone else's game. Machiavelli forces us to grow up. He strips away the romanticism of politics, of leadership, of human interaction, and says, look, this is how the world works. Do you want to pretend, or do you want to play? And that question, whether we admit it or not, is one we all have to answer. Because if we don't choose our role in the world, someone else will assign it for us. So here's the final question for this first chapter. What if becoming dangerous not in a violent sense, but in a mental and strategic sense is the most moral thing you can do in a world that rewards deception? What if the only way to stay good is to be strong? The psychology of power, why good people stay weak, and how to break the spell. Most people aren't weak because they were born that way. They're weak because they were trained to be, conditioned, programmed. From childhood, we're taught to obey, to comply, to avoid conflict. We're told that anger is dangerous, ambition is greedy, and power is corrupting. And so, we shrink ourselves. We learn to suppress our instincts, to question our own judgments, and to defer to authority. We become manageable, acceptable, safe. But Machiavelli asks a dangerous question: safe for whom? The truth is, systems don't want people who think for themselves. They want people who follow. And if you've ever wondered why so many good, intelligent, compassionate people live lives of quiet frustration, this is why. They've been taught to believe that strength is selfish, that strategy is manipulation, and that standing firm is arrogance. So they dim their light. They wait for permission. They hope that if they're kind enough, life will reward them. But life doesn't reward hope. It rewards action. And Machiavelli understood that better than almost anyone. He saw that the real battle isn't fought with swords or politics, it's fought in the mind. Power begins with perception. If you see yourself as small, as helpless, as a victim of circumstance, you will act that way. You'll make yourself easy to ignore. You'll second-guess yourself in every negotiation. You'll apologize for existing too loudly. And the worst part, you'll think you're being virtuous, but you're not. You're just being controlled. Let me ask you something that might sting. When was the last time you said yes when you really meant no? Or stayed silent when you should have spoken? Or let someone cross a boundary because you didn't want to seem rude? These moments might feel small, but they're not. They are psychological fractures, tiny cracks in your sense of self. And over time they add up. They drain your energy. They weaken your will. And they train you to betray yourself in the name of being nice. Machiavelli would say this: you cannot be truly good until you are first capable of being dangerous. Because if your goodness is just helplessness in disguise, It's not virtue, it's vulnerability. Real virtue, real morality, requires strength. It requires the ability to choose restraint, not the inability to act. A lion that doesn't attack because it doesn't need to, that's power. A lion that can't attack at all, that's prey. And this is where the transformation begins. Once you understand that power is not evil, but neutral, that it simply amplifies who you already are, you begin to see through the spell. You stop demonizing ambition. You stop apologizing for your intelligence. You stop hiding your intensity. And slowly you reclaim the parts of yourself you were taught to suppress, the parts that make you sharp, focused, unshakable. But it's not enough to just want power. You have to understand it. And that begins with studying the human mind, yours and everyone else's. You learn that people are not always motivated by logic, and that fear, ego, and insecurity drive more decisions than reason ever will. You start to see the patterns, the manipulation tactics, the passive aggression, the guilt trips. You recognize when someone is trying to dominate a room without saying a word, and instead of reacting emotionally, you respond strategically. That's how ordinary minds become weapons, not by becoming heartless, but by becoming aware. Aware of how power moves, how influence works, how emotion can be weaponized, and most importantly, how to remain rooted in your values while navigating a world that often rewards those who abandon theirs. But let's be clear, this isn't about turning into some cold, calculating machine. This is about integration, about becoming whole, and the thinker and the fighter, the philosopher and the strategist, the heart and the blade. Because when you embody both softness and strength, kindness and cunning, you become something rare, someone who is impossible to manipulate. So here's the question that cracks the illusion. What if the reason you've stayed stuck isn't because you're not good enough, but because you've been taught to be too good to fight back? And what if unlearning that lie is the first step toward not just power, but peace? Machiavelli's lessons aren't about turning people into monsters. They're about turning people into masters of their own fate, their own mind, their own power. And once you break the spell of weakness, you don't just change how others see you. You change how you see yourself. The strategic mind, how to think like a prince in a world of pawns. To think like a prince is not to chase thrones or titles, it's to master the game everyone else is blindly playing. Most people go through life as pawns, moved by emotions they don't understand, manipulated by forces they don't see, reacting instead of responding, surviving instead of strategizing. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince as a guide for tyrants. He wrote it as a manual for anyone brave enough to abandon the illusion of fairness and begin to think with precision. He wrote it for those ready to stop being played and start becoming players. A prince isn't defined by his status, but he's defined by his vision, by his ability to see 10 moves ahead while others are still figuring out the rules. He knows that every interaction is a negotiation, every word a possible weapon, every silence a potential strategy. And most importantly, he knows this: people rarely say what they mean, and they almost never mean what they promise. If you forget that, you will suffer. Not because the world is cruel, but because you weren't paying attention. Thinking like a prince means adopting a new mental architecture. It means you stop assuming people are honest just because they smile. It means you stop revealing your intentions before the right moment. It means you stop moving emotionally and start moving tactically. You begin to ask yourself questions that pawns never consider. What are they not saying? What do they want me to think? What would I do if I were in their position? These aren't paranoid thoughts. They're protective ones. Because once you understand what motivates people's status, control, validation, you stop taking their actions personally. You start seeing them as patterns. Let me ask you something sharp. When was the last time you watched someone manipulate a room with charm and you admired them instead of resenting them? That shift, admiration over anger, is the beginning of a strategic mind. Because the moment you stop being offended by power and start studying it, you become dangerous in the best way. You stop being prey, you start becoming a presence. Machiavelli urges us to understand that appearance often matters more than reality. Not because truth is irrelevant, but because perception shapes truth in the minds of the masses. If you appear weak, you will be treated as weak no matter how noble your intentions. If you appear confident, you will be trusted even if your competence is average. The prince understands this. He doesn't just build power, he projects it. His presence communicates more than his words. And his silence, when wielded purposefully, speaks louder than any speech. But here's the nuance that most people miss. Machiavelli never said you must lie, cheat, or destroy to win. He said you must understand those who do and be prepared to respond. If everyone is playing chess and you're still playing checkers, you will lose. Not because you aren't smart, but because you refuse to upgrade your thinking. A strategic mind doesn't chase every battle, it chooses them. It doesn't fight to prove a point, it fights to win. It doesn't need constant validation, it moves quietly, letting results speak. And it never, ever shows its full hand. Because the moment you reveal everything you know, everything you feel, and everything you want, you give away all your leverage. This isn't about paranoia. It's about precision. It's about understanding that kindness without boundaries is exploitation waiting to happen. That loyalty without discernment is a trap. That trust, when given too freely, becomes a liability. The prince doesn't stop loving, but he loves selectively. He doesn't stop giving, but he gives with awareness. He doesn't stop believing, but he balances belief with skepticism. And in doing so, he gains something powerful: freedom. The freedom to act without being predictable, to speak without being controlled, and to move through the world not as a victim of circumstance, but as an architect of it. So here's your reflection point. What if every single day you're being invited into silent power games and losing them simply because you didn't realize a game was being played? What if your mind, sharpened with strategy, could become your greatest weapon, not to dominate others, but to never be dominated again? Machiavelli gave us the blueprint, not for corruption but for clarity, not for cruelty but for control. And once you learn to think like a prince, the world stops being a maze of confusion. It becomes a board, and you become the one moving the pieces. The final weapon: how ruthless compassion makes you unstoppable. There's a misconception that power and compassion must live on opposite ends of the spectrum, that to be strong, you must harden your heart, and to be kind, you must soften your spine. But Machiavelli reveals something far more dangerous, far more liberating. When compassion is fused with strategy, when love is governed by wisdom, it becomes unstoppable. What he teaches us, if we read closely, is that the highest form of power isn't cruelty. It's ruthless compassion. Ruthless compassion doesn't mean coldness. It doesn't mean apathy. It means you care, but you care with boundaries. You love, but you don't bleed for people who cut you. You give, but not at the cost of your soul. It means you're capable of kindness without becoming a doormat, and capable of mercy without becoming a martyr. It's a balancing act that only the strongest minds can manage. And it might just be the final evolution of what Machiavelli was pointing toward all along. Because what good is power if it makes you empty? What's the value in winning if you lose your humanity in the process? The goal was never to become a tyrant. The goal was to stop being tricked by them. The goal was never to abandon emotion, but it was to master emotion. The prince who rules only with fear is brittle. The one who rules with both fear and love measured, precise and intentional is untouchable. Let's break this down. Ruthless compassion means you can fire someone who's dragging the team down and still treat them with dignity. It means you can walk away from toxic relationships not because you don't care, but because you care about your future more. It means you can say no without guilt and yes without fear. This kind of strength isn't loud, it's not theatrical. It's surgical, and it changes everything. Most people think compassion means saying yes to everyone. But that's not compassion, that's addiction to approval. Real compassion sometimes means saying the hard thing, making the unpopular choice, cutting ties with people who refuse to grow. And yes, it can feel cruel in the moment. But if it's rooted in clarity, in a deep understanding of what you're building, it's not cruelty, it's leadership. Machiavelli would have called it necessary severity, not for the sake of ego, but for the sake of order. And that's the paradox we must embrace. To protect what's good, you must sometimes wield what's dark. To guide others, you must first master yourself. Because if you can't enforce your standards, your compassion becomes irrelevant. Your love becomes ineffective. Your morals become tools for others to manipulate you. And in that condition, your goodness becomes your weakness. But when your compassion has teeth, when your kindness is backed by strength, then your presence becomes transformative. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. How many times have you let someone stay in your life out of guilt, even though they were slowly poisoning your peace? How often have you said yes to avoid conflict, even though it cost you energy, time, or self-respect? These aren't just emotional mistakes, they're strategic failures. And every time you choose temporary comfort over long-term clarity, you pay the price in silence. Machiavelli didn't want us to become monsters. He wanted us to wake up, to realize that the world doesn't reward the most virtuous, it rewards the most effective. And to be truly effective, we must integrate the two halves of ourselves, the light and the dark, the love and the logic, the heart and the blade. So here's the final question, the one that defines everything. What if the most powerful version of you isn't the one who's always kind or always ruthless, but the one who knows when to be each? What if your true strength lies in your ability to switch modes, to lead with empathy, but strike with precision when the moment demands it? This is the last lesson, the fusion of power and principle, and the transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary. When you walk with ruthless compassion, you don't just survive in a Machiavellian world, you master it. Not by playing dirty, but by playing smart. Not by betraying your soul, but by protecting it with everything you've got. And when that happens, when your mind becomes a weapon sharpened by wisdom, and your heart stays intact, you're no longer a pawn. You're no longer even a prince. You're the one writing the game.